The ride that changed everything. The sunset should have been beautiful. Instead, Mara Bennett watched something impossible cross her prairie. A rider who should have been dead hours ago slumped forward in his saddle, arms wrapped around something she couldn't yet see. When Caleb Rowe's horse finally stopped at her fence line, she understood why he hadn't fallen. He was holding two infants against his chest, their small fists clutched in his blood-soaked shirt. He'd ridden 40 miles through hell itself, and when his eyes met hers, she saw a man who'd chosen to survive for someone else's sake. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. Now, let me tell you how a dying man's choice saved more than just two babies. The heat had been merciless all day, the kind that made the Nebraska plain shimmer like water that would never quench your thirst. Mara Bennett stood on her porch, one hand shading her eyes, watching the horizon the way she'd learned to watch everything since Daniel died. Alert, wary, expecting nothing good. She'd been a widow for 3 years, long enough that people in town had stopped offering sympathy and started offering advice. Long enough that she'd learned to run the ranch herself, learned which hands would work honestly and which would test her because she was a woman alone. Long enough that the softness she'd once carried had turned to something harder, something that kept her upright when grief tried to pull her down. The ranch wasn't much. 200 acres of stubborn grass, a barn that needed repairs she couldn't afford, a house that felt too big with just her rattling around inside it. But it was hers. Daniel had built it with his own hands, and she'd be damned if she'd let it fall apart just because he was gone. Her dog, Rust, lifted his head from the porch boards and growled low in his throat. Mara's hand dropped to the rifle she kept propped beside the door. Out here, you didn't wait to see if trouble was friendly. But what appeared on the horizon wasn't the usual kind of trouble. At first, it was just a dark shape against the burning sky, wavering in the heat distortion. Then gradually, as the minutes crawled past, it took form, a horse moving at a walk, its head low, its rider slumped forward in a way that spoke of either sleep or death. Mara's fingers tightened on the rifle. Rust stood, hackles raised. The horse kept coming, slow and determined, following some internal compass toward her fence line. As it drew closer, Mara's breath caught in her throat. She knew that horse. Knew the rider too, though she'd never seen Caleb Rowe look like this, like a man held together by nothing but will and spite. Caleb had worked a few jobs on neighboring ranches over the past year. Quiet man, good with horses, the kind who did his work and didn't make trouble. She'd hired him twice herself for breaking colts, and he'd been fair and capable. But this was something else entirely. Blood darkened his shirt from shoulder to waist. His hat was gone, his dark hair matted with dust and sweat. But his arms were locked around something pressed against his chest, something he protected even in what looked like unconsciousness. Mara was off the porch before she made the conscious decision to move. "Caleb!" Her voice cracked across the dusty yard. "Caleb Rowe!" The horse stopped at the fence line, too well trained to go further without direction. For a moment, nothing moved except the wind pulling at Mara's skirts and Caleb's hair. Then his eyes opened. They were fever bright, burning in a face gone gray beneath the prairie tan. He looked at her, and she saw recognition flicker, followed immediately by something that looked like relief so profound it was almost grief. "Mrs. Bennett?" His voice was a rasp, barely audible. "Need help." His arms shifted slightly, and Mara saw what he'd been protecting. 2 babies. Couldn't have been more than a few months old, wrapped in what had once been a clean blanket, but was now stained with dust and blood. They were alive. She could see the small movements, hear the weak, mewling cries that spoke of hunger and fear and exhaustion. Jesus Christ! Mara was already moving, climbing the fence with her skirts hiked up, rifle still in one hand. What happened? Where's their mother? Dead. The single word fell like a stone. All dead. Found them. Under a wagon. Couldn't leave them. He was swaying now, and Mara realized what had been keeping him upright. Pure, stubborn refusal to let those babies fall. The moment she reached up to take the first infant, Caleb's body began to fold. She grabbed the baby, a girl she thought, though it was hard to tell under all the grime, and tucked her against her shoulder with one arm. "Don't you dare fall off that horse until I get the other one," she commanded, her voice sharp with the kind of authority she'd learned from necessity. Caleb's jaw tightened. He held on. Mara took the second baby, another girl, identical to the first. Twins. God help them. Twins who'd lost everything before they were old enough to know what losing meant. "All right," she said, stepping back. "Now you can—" Caleb pitched sideways out of the saddle and hit the ground hard. Mara's heart jumped, but there was nothing she could do with 2 infants in her arms and a rifle hooked in the crook of her elbow. She raised her voice instead. "Miguel! Rose! Get out here now!" The bunkhouse door flew open, and Miguel Garcia appeared, followed closely by Rose Crawford. Miguel was Mara's longest-standing ranch hand, a man in his 50s who'd worked for Daniel and stayed on out of loyalty and because the work was steady. Rose was his daughter, 17 and tougher than most men twice her age, who helped with everything from cooking to fence repair. They took in the scene with the quick assessment of people who'd learned to react first and ask questions later. "Mother of God," Miguel breathed, already moving toward Caleb's crumpled form. "Is he shot?" "I don't know. Get him inside. Rose, I need clean water, milk if we have any fresh, and every clean cloth in the house." Rose was already running. Mara stood there, a baby in each arm, watching Miguel haul Caleb's unconscious body toward the house, with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd dealt with injured ranch hands before. The twins were crying now, thin wails that spoke of hunger and fear. She looked down at their small, dirt-streaked faces. They couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 months old. Their eyes were blue, that deep, indeterminate baby blue that might change or might stay. Dark wisps of hair curled against their scalps. Under the grime and the fear, they were beautiful. "All dead," Caleb had said. Mara's chest tightened. She'd seen enough violence on the frontier to know what that probably meant. Ambush, massacre, the kind of brutality that happened when men decided other people's lives were worth less than whatever they wanted to take. And Caleb had found these babies in the wreckage and ridden God knew how far, injured and alone, to bring them here. To her. Why here? Why not to town, to the marshal, to someone with actual authority to handle orphaned children? But standing there in the fading light, with 2 small lives crying in her arms and a dying man bleeding on her floor, Mara thought she understood. Caleb had needed someone he could trust, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions before acting, someone who had the strength to do what needed doing. He'd chosen her. God help them all. Inside, the house had erupted into controlled chaos. Miguel had Caleb on the kitchen table, the only surface large enough, and was cutting away the blood-soaked shirt. Rose appeared with her arms full of supplies, her young face set in determined lines. "How bad?" Mara asked, moving closer while trying to soothe the crying infants against her shoulders. Miguel's weathered face was grim. Gunshot wound, left shoulder, went clean through, which is good. But he's lost blood. And this, he indicated a nasty gash along Caleb's ribs. "This is infected. He should have stopped for help yesterday. He couldn't." Mara looked down at the babies. "He was carrying them." Rose's eyes widened as she noticed the infants for the first time. "Sweet Jesus, where did they come from?" "Caleb found them. That's all I know right now." Mara made a decision. "Rose, I need you to take these 2. Get them cleaned up, fed if you can. There's an old cradle in the attic from when the Johnsons left their furniture. Bring it down to my room. Miguel and I will handle Caleb." Rose took the babies with the careful competence of a girl who'd helped raise 6 younger siblings before her mother died. The moment they were in her arms, she was murmuring soft reassurances, already moving toward the pump and the warm water. Mara rolled up her sleeves and moved to the table. She'd done this before, patched up ranch hands, set broken bones, dug out splinters and treated rope burns and all the other injuries that came with hard work and harder land. She'd never liked it, but she'd learned not to flinch. "Talk to me," she said to Miguel. "What do we do first?" They worked through the evening and into the night. The shoulder wound was clean, just as Miguel had said, through and through, missing bone and major vessels by what must have been sheer luck. They cleaned it, packed it with the closest thing they had to antiseptic, whiskey and clean cloth, and bound it tight. The infection in the gash along his ribs was worse. Mara had to clean it 3 times, digging out dirt and debris while Caleb's unconscious body jerked and twisted against the restraints they'd rigged to keep him still. Miguel held him down with strong, steady hands while Mara worked, and neither of them spoke except to request supplies or give warnings. By the time they were finished, Mara's hands were shaking and her back ached from leaning over the table. Caleb's breathing was ragged but steady, his fever high but not catastrophic. "He'll live," Miguel said, wiping his bloody hands on a rag. "If the infection doesn't take hold worse, if he doesn't develop pneumonia, if—" "He'll live," Mara interrupted, her voice firm. "He didn't ride 40 miles through hell to die in my kitchen." Miguel looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes knowing. "You don't even know where he came from, what happened out there." "No," Mara agreed, "but I know he saved those babies. That's enough for now." They moved Caleb to the spare room, the one that had been Daniel's office before he died, that Mara hadn't been able to bring herself to change. It felt right, somehow, to put Caleb there. Daniel would have done the same thing, taken in the wounded stranger, asked questions later. Upstairs, in Mara's own bedroom, Rose had worked miracles. The twins were clean, dressed in shirts that were far too big for them, cut down from some of Rose's own clothes, and sleeping in the old cradle that Rose had scrubbed and lined with soft blankets. Their little faces were peaceful now, their breathing soft and even. "They took milk," Rose whispered, sitting in the rocking chair beside the cradle with a fierce, protective expression on her young face. "Not much, but enough. They're strong, Mrs. Bennet. They're going to be all right." Mara sank down on the edge of her bed, exhaustion hitting her all at once. "Did you check them for injuries?" "Head to toe. They're perfect. Not a scratch on them." Rose's voice caught. "Someone protected them real good before whatever happened. Before their mother died. Before their father died. Before their whole world ended in violence and blood, and they were too young to even know it." Mara reached down and touched the edge of the cradle, setting it rocking gently. "We'll keep them safe," she heard herself say, "until we figure out what to do." Rose nodded, but something in her expression suggested she thought Mara was fooling herself about the "until" part. Maybe she was. Mara sent Rose to bed and sat alone in the dark, watching the babies sleep. They were so small, so fragile. In the morning, she'd need to send Miguel to town to report what had happened, to try to find out if anyone knew about an attack, about missing families, about 2 baby girls who'd somehow survived what their parents hadn't. But tonight, they were safe. Caleb was alive. And for reasons Mara didn't want to examine too closely, that felt like enough. She must have dozed because she woke to the sound of footsteps on the stairs, Miguel's distinctive heavy tread. "Caleb's awake," he said quietly from the doorway. "Asking for you." Mara rose, checked that the babies were still sleeping peacefully, and followed Miguel downstairs. Caleb was propped up slightly in the narrow bed, his face still gray but his eyes clear. When he saw her, something in his expression eased. "The babies," he said immediately. "Are they safe, clean, fed, sleeping?" Mara pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. "Now you're going to tell me what happened out there." Caleb's jaw worked for a moment. Then, slowly, he began to speak. He'd been heading north, looking for work, following the river trail that cut through the empty country between settlements. 3 days ago, he'd smelled smoke. Found a wagon burning, 2 adults dead, shot in the back like they'd been trying to run. The whole scene had been ransacked, supplies stolen, horses gone, even the clothes stripped from the bodies. "I was going to bury them," Caleb said, his voice rough. "Started digging. Then I heard crying. The babies had been hidden under the wagon bed, wrapped in a blanket and tucked into a wooden box, deliberately concealed. Their mother must have hidden them in those last desperate moments, must have known what was coming and made a choice to save what she could. I couldn't leave them." Caleb's eyes met Mara's, and she saw something raw there, something that went deeper than the immediate horror. "They were looking at me, trusting me. I just couldn't." So he'd taken them, wrapped them in his own blanket, tied them against his chest with strips of cloth, and started riding. He hadn't known where he was going exactly, just north, toward settlements, toward help. But he'd been injured in a separate encounter the day before. had already been running a fever when he found the babies. As the hours passed, as the sun beat down and his strength faded, he'd started to doubt he'd make it. Then he'd remembered Mara. "I worked for you last spring," he said. "You were fair, paid on time, treated everyone decent, and you were—" He paused, searching for words. "You were strong. I thought if anyone could handle this, could keep them safe, it would be you." Mara's throat tightened. "You should have stopped for help earlier. You almost died." "If I'd stopped, someone might have taken them, sent them to an orphanage, or worse." Caleb's voice was steady, despite his weakness. "They deserved better than that. Deserved someone who'd care. You don't even know them. Neither did you, but you took them in anyway." Caleb's eyes drifted closed, exhaustion pulling at him. "Thank you, Mrs. Bennett, for not turning me away." "Call me Mara," she said quietly. "And you're not going anywhere until you're healed. We clear?" A faint smile touched his lips. "Yes, ma'am." She sat with him until his breathing evened out into sleep, then returned upstairs to check on the twins. They were still peaceful, still perfect, still utterly dependent on the choices of strangers. Mara stood at the window, looking out at the dark prairie. Somewhere out there, men who'd murdered those babies' parents were going about their lives, probably thinking they'd gotten away clean. Somewhere out there, other families were sleeping safe, unaware of how quickly safety could shatter. And here, in this house that had felt too empty for too long, 3 broken lives had collided in a way that felt less like accident and more like providence. Mara didn't believe in signs, didn't believe the universe arranged things for meaning or purpose. But she believed in choices, in the decision to do right even when it was hard, even when it cost you. Caleb had made that choice when he found those babies. Now it was her turn. The next morning arrived too quickly, announced by the twins' hungry cries just after dawn. Mara rose, stiff and sore from sleeping in the chair, and tended to them, changing the makeshift diapers Rose had fashioned, feeding them careful spoonfuls of milk mixed with a little water to make it easier to digest. They were so small in her hands, so trusting. It terrified her. Rose appeared as the sun was fully up, looking more rested than Mara felt. "I'll take over here if you want to check on Caleb," she offered. Downstairs, Miguel was already in the kitchen, coffee brewing and breakfast started. He nodded toward the spare room. "Checked on him an hour ago. Fever's down. He's tough, that one." "That one rode 40 miles with a bullet in him and 2 babies on his chest," Mara said, pouring herself coffee. "Tough doesn't quite cover it." She found Caleb awake, staring at the ceiling with an expression of someone trying to decide if they were grateful to be alive or angry about it. "How do you feel?" she asked from the doorway. "Like I got shot and rode 40 miles. He turned his head to look at her. "The twins?" "Healthy, hungry. Rose is with them now." Mara came into the room and set a cup of water on the bedside table. "I'm sending Miguel to town today, to report what happened, see if anyone knows anything." Caleb's expression darkened. "They'll want to take them." "Maybe. Maybe not." Mara sat in the chair she'd occupied the night before. "But we can't just keep 2 babies without anyone knowing. There are laws, procedures. Laws didn't save their parents." The words hung in the air, sharp and true. Mara took a breath. "I know, but we do this right, or we put those girls in danger. If there's family out there looking for them, they deserve to know the babies are safe. If there's not—" She paused. "Then we figure out what comes next." Caleb studied her for a long moment. "You're thinking about keeping them?" It wasn't a question. Mara looked down at her hands. "I'm thinking about what's right for them. That's all." "That's not all." Caleb's voice was soft but certain. "You lost someone. I can see it. And now there are 2 babies who lost everyone. You're thinking maybe you could help each other." Mara's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you're alone in a house too big for one person. I know you run a ranch that should take 3 men, and you do it yourself because you're too stubborn to quit. I know you took in a stranger and 2 orphaned babies without hesitation." Caleb shifted, wincing at the pain the movement caused. "I know you're stronger than you think you are. Strength doesn't make me a mother." "No," Caleb agreed, "but love does. And you already love them. I can see it." Mara stood abruptly. "You need rest. I'll bring you something to eat later." She left before he could say anything else, before he could voice the truth she wasn't ready to admit. He was right. Somewhere between taking those babies in her arms and watching them sleep in the cradle beside her bed, she'd made a decision that had nothing to do with duty or responsibility and everything to do with the ache in her chest when she thought about them going somewhere else. But wanting something didn't make it possible, didn't make it right. Miguel left for town mid-morning, riding out with instructions to speak to the marshal, to check if anyone had reported missing family members, to gather whatever information he could find. Mara watched him go, then returned to the work that didn't stop just because her life had gotten complicated. Horses to feed, fences to check, 100 small tasks that kept a ranch running. Rose stayed with the twins and by midday had established a routine that spoke of natural maternal instinct. Mara found her in the kitchen, one baby propped on her hip while she stirred something on the stove with her free hand. "They're so good," Rose said, smiling down at the infant. One of the twins, Mara still couldn't tell them apart, hardly cried at all once they had full bellies. "We're going to need proper supplies," Mara said, mentally calculating costs she couldn't really afford. "Diapers, clothes that actually fit, bottles if we can get them." "I can make diapers," Rose offered immediately. "And there's fabric in the trunk upstairs. I can cut down some things, make them proper gowns." Mara looked at this girl who should have been thinking about dances and courtship, not caring for orphaned infants. "You don't have to do this, Rose. It's not your responsibility." Rose's chin lifted in a gesture Mara recognized, the stubborn determination of someone who'd decided something and wouldn't be moved. "They need help. I can help. That makes it my responsibility." God, when had 17-year-olds gotten so wise? The day passed in a blur of work and worry. Caleb slept most of the time, waking only to drink water and accept the broth Mara brought him. The twins followed their own schedule of eating and sleeping and crying, and Mara found herself learning their rhythms, understanding which cry meant hunger and which meant fear. By evening, she could tell them apart, not by appearance, which was still nearly identical, but by temperament. One was quieter, more watchful, with eyes that seemed to track everything. The other was fiercer, more demanding, with a cry that could wake the dead when she decided she needed something. Mara found herself calling them the quiet one and the fierce one, knowing they'd need real names eventually, but not ready to make that choice. Naming them would make it real, would make them hers, in a way that felt too big, too permanent. Miguel returned just before sunset, his expression grim. They gathered in the kitchen after the twins were settled, Mara, Rose, and Miguel around the table with coffee and the weight of waiting. "What did you find?" Mara asked. Miguel rubbed his weathered face. "Marshall knew about it already. Attack happened 3 days ago, like Caleb said. Wagon train. Just 2 families traveling together, the Carsons and the Mitchells. They were heading to Montana to claim land." Mara's chest tightened. "And?" "Everyone dead except the babies. Marshall found the site yesterday, buried the bodies this morning." Miguel's voice was heavy. "He said it looked like a robbery gone bad. Professional job, took everything of value, left nothing to identify who did it." "The babies," Rose said quietly. "Did he know about them?" "No." Miguel shook his head. "They were listed as dead too. The parents, 2 hired drivers, and the twin baby girls. That's what the manifest said." The words settled over the room like ash. "So as far as anyone knows," Mara said slowly, "those babies are dead." "Yes." Miguel met her eyes. "Caleb saved them from more than just dying. He saved them from being counted as casualties and forgotten." Rose's hand went to her mouth. "What do we do?" Mara stood, pacing to the window. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly, indifferent to human tragedy. She thought about those parents, making the desperate choice to hide their daughters. Thought about Caleb, refusing to leave them behind. Thought about herself, already planning how to make space in her life for 2 small, unexpected lives. "We tell the truth," she said finally. "Tomorrow, I'll go to town myself. Talk to the marshal, explain what Caleb did. Let them know the babies survived. And then," Rose pressed, "and then we see if anyone comes looking for them." Mara turned back to face them. "If there's family who has a legal claim, who'll care for them properly, then—" She swallowed hard. Then we do what's right. And if there's not? Miguel asked gently. Mara looked at him, this man who'd known her through grief and hardship, who understood the language of survival. Then I guess we become their family. The words hung in the air, a commitment and a hope and a terror all at once. Rose smiled, tears shining in her eyes. Miguel nodded slowly, acceptance written in every line of his weathered face. Upstairs, one of the twins began to cry, the fierce one, demanding attention on her own schedule. Mara excused herself and climbed the stairs, her heart pounding with the weight of what she'd just promised. The baby's face was scrunched up and red, her small fists waving in indignation at whatever slight she'd perceived. Mara picked her up, cradled her against her shoulder, and felt that small body relax immediately into trust. "I've got you," she whispered into the downy hair. "I've got you both. I promise." It was a promise she had no idea how to keep, no certainty she could fulfill. But standing there in the fading light, with a baby in her arms and two more broken souls sleeping under her roof, Mara Bennett made a choice. She would try. Whatever came next, whatever obstacles appeared, whatever pain waited in the future, she would try. Because Caleb was right. She was stronger than she thought she was. And these babies deserve someone willing to be strong for them. Morning came with the kind of clarity that only followed sleepless nights. Mara had dozed fitfully in the chair beside the cradle, startling awake at every small sound the twins made, her mind churning through scenarios she couldn't control. Now, with dawn light streaming through the window and Rose arriving to take over the morning feeding, Mara dressed in her most respectable clothes. The dark blue dress she'd worn to Daniel's funeral, the one that made her look serious and capable rather than desperate. She needed the marshal to see her as someone competent to care for two infants, not as a grieving widow grasping at replacements for what she'd lost. Even if that's partly what she was. Downstairs, she found Caleb awake and attempting to sit up, his face tight with pain and determination in equal measure. "What do you think you're doing?" Mara crossed the room and pressed her hand firmly against his good shoulder, pushing him back down. "You'll tear those stitches and bleed all over my clean sheets." "Need to get up," Caleb said through gritted teeth. "Can't just lie here while you handle everything." "Yes, you can. In fact, you will." Mara pulled the blanket back over him with more force than strictly necessary. "I'm going to town to talk to the marshal. When I get back, if you're still in that bed like you're supposed to be, I'll tell you everything. If you've gotten up and hurt yourself, I'll let Miguel sit on you until you see sense." Despite the pain written across his features, Caleb's mouth twitched toward something that might have been a smile. "You always this bossy?" "Only when people try to die in my house after doing something heroic. It's inconvenient, and I won't allow it." She softened slightly, seeing the genuine worry beneath his stubbornness. "The twins are fine, Caleb. Rose is with them. I promise I'll fight for them as hard as you rode to save them." Something in his eyes eased. "I know you will. That's why I brought them here." The words settled in Mara's chest, warm and heavy. She nodded once, not trusting her voice, and left before the weight of that trust could paralyze her. Miguel had the wagon ready, having anticipated her needs with the quiet efficiency she'd come to rely on. The ride to town took 2 hours, 2 hours of rehearsing what she'd say, how she'd explain the impossible situation they'd found themselves in. The marshal's office sat on the main street of Blackwater, a town that had grown just enough to need law but not enough to attract the kind of lawman who had better options. Marshal Tom Brennan was competent enough, fair in his way, but he followed rules because rules were easier than thinking too hard about right and wrong. Mara had known him since he'd arrived 3 years ago. He'd been kind after Daniel died, had checked on her more than once to make sure she was managing. But kindness and flexibility were different things. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his weathered features. "Mrs. Bennett, didn't expect to see you in town today. I need to talk to you about the attack, the Carsons and the Mitchells." Brennan's expression shifted to something more guarded. "Miguel told you about it then. Terrible business. I'm sorry you had to hear those details." "The babies didn't die," Mara said without preamble. "The twin girls, they're alive." The marshal went very still. Then he slowly set down the pen he'd been holding and leaned back in his chair. "What did you say?" Mara told him everything. Caleb's arrival, the condition of the babies, The story he'd told about finding them hidden beneath the wagon. She kept her voice steady, laying out facts like she was reporting a broken fence rather than overturning the official account of a massacre. When she finished, Brennan was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the desk. "This Caleb Rowe," he said finally. "I know that name. He's worked ranches around here on and off for the past year or so. Good reputation. Keeps to himself. He nearly died bringing those babies to safety." "I don't doubt it." Brennan stood and moved to the window, looking out at the dusty street. "But this complicates things considerably, Mrs. Bennett. Those babies are officially dead. There's been burials, reports filed, notices sent to next of kin." "What next of kin?" Mara interrupted. "You said everyone was killed." "The Carsons had family back east. Brother of the father, I believe, name of Edmund Carson. He's been notified of his brother's death and the loss of the children." Brennan turned back to face her. "He'll be expecting to settle the estate, such as it is. Finding out there are surviving heirs changes everything." Mara's stomach dropped. "He'd have a legal claim." "He would. As the girl's uncle, he'd be their closest living relative." Brennan's tone was careful, watching her face. "Unless there's a will that says otherwise, and given they were young families just starting out, I doubt there is." "So some stranger back east who never even met these babies gets to decide their future?" "That's generally how the law works, yes." Brennan returned to his desk but didn't sit. "I understand you've gotten attached, Mrs. Bennett, but—" "Attached?" The word came out sharper than she intended. "Marshall, I watched Caleb Rowe ride up to my fence half dead from blood loss, with 2 infants strapped to his chest. I cleaned them, fed them, kept them alive through the night while he was unconscious and bleeding. Don't talk to me about attached like it's some passing fancy." Brennan held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I didn't mean offense. I'm just trying to help you see the reality of the situation. The law is the law. If Edmund Carson wants those girls, he has every right to claim them. And if he doesn't want them, if he just wants to settle an estate and be done with it," Mara pressed, "what happens to them then?" "There's an orphanage in Cheyenne. Good people run it, from what I hear." "No." The word came out flat and final. "Those babies are not going to an orphanage. Their mother died hiding them, trying to save them. Caleb nearly died bringing them to safety. I'll be damned if they end up in some institution being raised by strangers who see them as charity cases." Brennan sighed, the sound of a man facing a problem he didn't want. "Mrs. Bennett, I sympathize, truly, I do. But unless you have legal standing, then I'll get legal standing." Mara met his eyes steadily. "What do I need to do?" The marshal studied her for a long moment. "You'd need to petition for guardianship. Show you can provide for them, give them a stable home. And you'd need Edmund Carson to either decline his claim or be found unfit." "How do I contact him?" "I'll send a telegram today. Let him know the situation has changed. But Mrs. Bennett," Brennan's voice softened, "you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that he'll want them. They're his blood. Some men take that seriously. Some men also take murder seriously, but whoever killed those babies' parents is still out there walking free," Mara countered. "Blood doesn't make you family, choice does." She left the marshal's office with her head held high and her hands shaking. The telegram would be sent. Edmund Carson would be informed. And then they'd wait to see if a stranger's claim to blood would tear apart the fragile family that had formed in her house. The ride back to the ranch felt twice as long. Mara's mind wouldn't settle, running through arguments she could make, ways she could prove her worth as a guardian. She had the ranch, had steady income from selling horses. She had Miguel and Rose to help. She had— what did she have, really? A house that needed repairs, a bank account that was never quite as full as she needed it to be, and 3 years of widowhood that some people would see as proof she was incomplete rather than capable. But she had something else too. She had the memory of those twin small bodies relaxing into trust when she held them. She had Caleb's faith that she was strong enough for this. She had her own stubborn refusal to let another innocent thing be destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. It would have to be enough. When she reached the ranch, Rose met her at the door with one of the twins, the quiet one, in her arms. "Caleb's been asking for you every 10 minutes, she said. exasperation and fondness mixed in her tone. I told him you'd tan his hide if he got out of bed, but I don't think he believed me. Where's the other one? Sleeping upstairs. This little darling was fussy, so I brought her down to walk with her. Rose shifted the baby to her shoulder, patting her back gently. How did it go in town? Mara gave her the abbreviated version. The telegram, the uncle, the uncertainty hanging over everything. Rose's young face grew serious as she listened. They can't take them, she said when Mara finished. Not after everything. They might not have a choice. Mara reached out and stroked the baby's downy head. But we'll fight. That's all we can do. She found Caleb exactly where she'd left him, though he looked restless enough to combust. The moment she entered the room, his eyes locked on her face, reading her expression. It's bad, he said. Not a question. Mara pulled the chair close and sat down, suddenly exhausted. There's an uncle, father's brother, back east. The marshal's sending him a telegram to let him know the babies survived. Caleb's jaw tightened. And he'll want them. Maybe. Maybe not. Mara folded her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. But if he does, he has the legal right. Blood relation trumps everything else. Blood relation, Caleb's voice was bitter. Where was this blood relation when his brother was heading west? When that family was riding alone through dangerous country? Where was he when they were being murdered? Probably safe in his house back east, living his life completely unaware. Mara met his eyes. Which isn't a crime, Caleb. We can't fault him for not being there. Can't we? Caleb shifted, pain flashing across his face with the movement. Those babies deserve better than being handed over to someone who sees them as an obligation. I know. Mara's voice was quiet. But wanting better doesn't change the law. They sat in heavy silence for a moment. Then Caleb spoke again, his tone different, thoughtful rather than angry. What would it take? To keep them here legally? Guardianship petition. Proof I can provide for them. And either Edmund Carson declining his claim or being found unfit. Mara laughed, the sound hollow. So, basically a miracle. You don't believe in miracles? No, she agreed. But I believe in fighting for what's right, so that's what we'll do. Caleb studied her, something shifting in his expression. You said we. Had she? Mara replayed her words and realized he was right. You meant we, Caleb interrupted gently. And you're right, this isn't just your fight. I'm the one who brought them here. I'm responsible too. You can barely sit up without wincing. You're in no condition to what? Care about whether those babies end up with someone who'll love them or just see them as a burden. Caleb's voice was steady despite his obvious pain. I'm plenty capable of that, Mrs. Bennett, and when I'm healed enough, I'll do whatever else needs doing. Mara wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't owe them anything more than he'd already given. But looking at his face, at the determination there, the fierce protectiveness, she understood that this wasn't about obligation. Caleb had made those babies his responsibility the moment he found them. He wasn't going to walk away any more than she was. All right, she said finally. We fight together. But first you heal. Deal? Deal. Caleb's eyes closed briefly, exhaustion catching up with determination. Tell me about them. The twins. What are they like? So Mara told him. Told him about the quiet one who watched everything with solemn eyes, and the fierce one who demanded attention on her own schedule. Told him about Rose's natural way with them, Miguel's gruff tenderness when he thought no one was watching. Told him about the small routines they'd already established, the rhythms of feeding and changing and soothing that were starting to feel almost normal. And as she talked, she saw Caleb's face relax, saw him sink deeper into the pillows with something that looked like peace. You haven't named them yet, he observed. No? Mara looked down at her hands. Naming them makes it real, makes them mine, and I don't know if I get to keep them. Name them anyway, Caleb said quietly. They deserve names that were chosen with love, not assigned by some bureaucrat or distant relative. Whatever happens, give them that. He was right. Mara knew he was right, but the thought of naming these babies, of speaking those names aloud and making them permanent, felt like standing on the edge of a cliff with no idea how far the drop was. The next 3 days passed in a strange suspension of normalcy and dread. The ranch work continued, horses still needed feeding, fences still needed mending, life still demanded attention. The twins settled into clearer patterns, and Mara found herself learning their small preferences, their individual quirks. The quiet one liked to be held close, pressed against a shoulder where she could hear a heartbeat. The fierce one preferred to face outward, watching the world with alert curiosity. The quiet one slept more soundly. The fierce one fought sleep like it was an enemy to be conquered. Rose proved invaluable, taking over much of their care with capable hands and a warmth that came naturally. Miguel surprised them all by carving a small rattle from a piece of scrap wood, sanding it smooth and testing it carefully before presenting it to the twins with gruff embarrassment. And Caleb healed, slowly but steadily, his fever breaking on the second day and his color returning by the third. He started sitting up without help, then standing for brief periods, then walking short distances with Miguel's support. Through it all, they waited for the telegram response that would determine everything. It came on the fourth day. Mara was in the barn, checking on a mare who was close to foaling, when Rose came running across the yard, her skirts hiked up and a piece of paper clutched in her hand. "It's here," she called out, breathless. "The marshal just rode out with it himself." Mara's heart dropped into her stomach. She climbed down from the stall slowly, wiping her hands on her work dress, and met Rose halfway across the yard. Marshal Brennan sat on his horse by the house, his expression carefully neutral. He dismounted when he saw her approaching. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, touching his hat brim. "Got a response from Edmund Carson." "And?" Mara couldn't make her voice work properly. Brennan handed her the telegram. "Better you read it yourself." Mara unfolded the paper with shaking hands. The message was brief, typed in the impersonal block letters of telegraph communication. "Shocked by news. Stop. Believed entire family lost. Stop. Will arrive. Blackwater 2 weeks' time. Stop. Assess situation personally. Stop. Edmund Carson." 2 weeks. They had 2 weeks before a stranger arrived to decide the fate of 2 babies who were just starting to feel like they belonged here. "He's coming," Mara said, her voice flat. "Appears so." Brennan shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Bennett, I want you to understand, when he gets here, he has the legal right to see those children, to make decisions about their care." "I understand the law, Marshal." "I know you do. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I want you to be prepared for whatever decision he makes." Mara looked up from the telegram, meeting his eyes. "Did he say anything else? Ask anything about how they are? Whether they're healthy?" Brennan shook his head. "Just what's written there." "So his brother's entire family was murdered? 2 infant nieces survived through a miracle, and all he says is he'll assess the situation?" Mara's hands crumpled the telegram. "That doesn't sound like a man who cares, Marshal. That sounds like a man worried about legal complications." "You don't know that. He might just be in shock processing the news. Or he might see 2 babies as a burden he never asked for." Mara's voice was hard. 2 weeks isn't much time to prove I can give them a better life than whatever he's planning." "Mrs. Bennett, I'd advise against getting your hopes too high." "My hopes are exactly where they need to be," Mara interrupted. "Thank you for bringing the telegram, Marshal. I'll make sure everything is in order for Mr. Carson's arrival." Brennan sighed but didn't argue further. He remounted his horse, tipped his hat once more, and rode back toward town. Mara stood in the yard, the telegram still clutched in her hand, and felt Rose's presence beside her. 2 weeks, Rose said quietly. 2 weeks, Mara confirmed. "Then we'd better make them count." Mara looked at this girl, this fierce, capable young woman who'd thrown herself into caring for 2 orphaned babies without hesitation, and felt a surge of gratitude so strong it threatened to overwhelm her. "We need to show I can provide for them," she said, her mind already working through possibilities. "The house needs to be spotless. The ranch needs to look prosperous. I need character references, financial records, everything that proves I'm not just some desperate widow grasping at replacements for what I lost." "You're not," Rose said firmly. "Anyone with eyes can see you love those babies. Love isn't enough, not in the eyes of the law. Mara started walking toward the house, purpose steadying her shaking hands. But it's a start, and we'll build from there. Inside, they found Caleb up and dressed, leaning against the doorframe of his room with obvious effort. He must have heard the marshal arrive, must have been listening. "How long do we have?" he asked. 2 weeks. Mara met his eyes. Then Edmund Carson arrives to assess the situation. 2 weeks. Caleb straightened, wincing but determined. Then we'd better get to work. "You're still healing?" "I can sit at a table and help plan. I can write letters, make lists, do whatever needs doing that doesn't require heavy lifting." His jaw was set in a line Mara was beginning to recognize, the same stubborn determination that had kept him alive on a 40-mile ride. "I'm not sitting on the sidelines while you fight this alone." Mara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he'd done enough, that he could rest now, that this wasn't his burden to carry. But she was tired of carrying everything alone. And maybe, just maybe, letting someone else help wasn't weakness. Maybe it was the kind of strength she'd forgotten how to access. "All right," she said, "then let's figure out how to win." They gathered around the kitchen table, Mara, Caleb, Rose, and Miguel, and began planning like they were preparing for battle. Because in a way, they were. Miguel knew ranchers throughout the territory who could provide character references. Rose suggested asking the local doctor to examine the twins, to provide documentation that they were healthy and well cared for. Caleb proposed tracking down anyone who'd known the Carson family, who might be able to speak to whether Edmund had ever shown interest in his brother's life or children. And Mara pulled out her financial records, her ledgers and receipts and bank statements, laying bare the reality of her situation. The ranch was stable but not prosperous. She made enough to cover expenses, to pay Miguel and occasionally hire extra help, to keep food on the table and the roof patched. But there was no excess, no comfortable margin. "It's not enough," she said, staring at the numbers. "A man like Edmund Carson, coming from back east, he'll probably have more money, more stability. How do I compete with that?" "You can't," Caleb said bluntly. "Not on money. So you compete on what matters more, which is love, commitment, the fact that these babies are already thriving here." Caleb leaned forward, intensity in his dark eyes. "You document everything, every meal, every time they smile, every small moment of progress. You show that in 2 weeks, hell, in 4 days. You've given them more genuine care than a stranger could provide in a year." "And if he argues he can provide more material advantages," Mara pressed, "then you argue that babies don't need material advantages. They need someone who gets up with them in the middle of the night, who learns what each different cry means, who holds them when they're scared." Caleb's voice was passionate now. "You think Edmund Carson is going to do that? Or is he going to hire a nurse, hand them off to someone else, treat them like obligations to be managed?" "We don't know that," Rose interjected quietly. "He might genuinely care." "Then let him prove it," Caleb shot back. "Let him show he's willing to disrupt his entire life for 2 babies he's never met. But until he does, we assume Mara has the better claim." Mara looked at the 3 faces around her table. Miguel's weathered wisdom, Rose's fierce loyalty, Caleb's passionate determination, and felt something shift in her chest. She wasn't alone in this. She'd never been alone. "All right," she said. "We build a case. We document everything. And when Edmund Carson arrives, we show him exactly what he'd be taking these babies away from." "And if it's not enough?" Miguel asked gently. Mara's hands tightened on the table edge. "Then at least we'll know we fought for them with everything we had." The quiet one chose that moment to cry upstairs, a small sound that quickly grew more insistent. Mara stood automatically, but Rose was already moving. "I'll get her," she said. "You keep planning." As Rose disappeared up the stairs, Mara heard Caleb's voice, quiet but certain. "It will be enough," he said. "It has to be." Mara wished she had his certainty, wished she could believe that love and determination could overcome law and blood and the cold calculations of men who saw children as assets to be managed. But wishing changed nothing. So she pulled her ledgers closer, picked up her pen, and began documenting everything that made this house a home worth fighting for. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly, indifferent to human hope and human heartbreak. Inside, 4 people bent over a table, planning a battle they couldn't afford to lose. And upstairs, two babies slept peacefully, unaware that their entire future hung in the balance of decisions being made by strangers. 2 weeks. It wasn't much time to build a case strong enough to overcome blood and law. But it was all they had, and they would make it count. The 2 weeks that followed were unlike anything Mara had experienced since Daniel's death. Then, she'd been paralyzed by grief, moving through days in a fog of disbelief. Now she moved with purpose so fierce it bordered on desperation, every moment dedicated to building an unassailable case that these babies belonged here, with her, in this house that had finally stopped feeling empty. The first thing she did was name them. It happened on the 5th night, when she was alone with the twins in the quiet hours before dawn. The fierce one had woken crying, and rather than wake Rose, Mara had brought both babies downstairs to the kitchen, where lamplight pooled warm and golden against the darkness outside. She held the fierce one against her shoulder, walking slow circles around the table while the quiet one watched from the basket Mara had lined with soft blankets. And as she walked, she found herself talking to them in a low voice, telling them about their parents, people she'd never met, but whose love was written in the desperate choice to hide their daughters in those final moments. "Your mama was brave," she whispered, "braver than I'll ever be. She saved you because she knew you were worth saving, because she saw a future for you even when hers was ending." The fierce one's crying had subsided to hiccuping whimpers. Mara shifted her gently, cradling her so they were face to face in the lamplight. "You need a name," she said softly. "Both of you need names, real names, chosen with love." She looked down at the baby in her arms, at those alert eyes that seemed to hold more determination than any infant should possess. "You're going to be a force of nature, aren't you? Going to fight for what you want, demand what you need." She paused, thinking of strength and fire, and the kind of courage that refused to yield. "Grace, that's your name, not because you're delicate, but because real grace is strength wrapped in beauty. Grace Carson Bennett." The name felt right the moment she spoke it aloud. Grace, a name that honored what this child had survived and what she would become. Mara turned to the basket where the quiet one lay watching, those solemn eyes tracking every movement. This baby was different, watchful where her sister was demanding, patient where Grace was fierce, but there was strength in her too, the kind that ran deep and steady. "And you," Mara said, settling into the rocking chair with Grace still in her arms while she gazed at the quiet one. "You see everything, don't you? Notice things the rest of us miss." She thought about faith and hope, about the quiet strength that endured when louder voices failed. Hope. Your name is Hope Carson Bennett, because you're proof that even in the darkest moments, hope survives. Hope finds a way. Grace and Hope. Two names that carried weight and meaning, that transformed these babies from generic orphans into specific, beloved children with identities worth fighting for. When Rose came down at dawn and heard the names, tears sprang to her eyes. "They're perfect," she said, taking Hope from her basket and cradling her close. Grace and Hope, like they were always meant to be called that. Caleb's reaction was quieter but no less profound. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table going through old newspapers, searching for any mention of the Carson family or Edmund Carson himself. When Mara told him, he looked up and something shifted in his expression, relief and recognition, and a kind of fierce satisfaction. "Good," he said simply. "Now they're real. Now anyone who wants to take them away has to acknowledge exactly who they're taking." The documentation effort consumed them all. Miguel rode to neighboring ranches and returned with written testimonials from men Mara had done business with over the years. Character references that spoke to her honesty, her capability, her strength. Rose went to town and convinced the local doctor to visit, to examine Grace and Hope, and provide medical documentation of their excellent health. Dr. Hayward was an older man, gruff but competent, who'd delivered half the babies in the territory and seen his share of hardship. He examined the twins with thorough efficiency, checking their responses, their growth, their general condition. When he finished, he sat at Mara's kitchen table and wrote out a detailed report in his cramped handwriting. "These babies are thriving," he said as he wrote. "Well-fed, appropriately responsive, no signs of neglect or poor care. In fact," he looked up at Mara over his spectacles, They're in better condition than many infants I see who've been with their birth families since delivery. Whatever you're doing, Mrs. Bennett, you're doing it right. Will you testify to that? Mara asked. If it comes to a legal challenge? Hayward's expression sobered. The uncle's really coming then. Brennan mentioned it might happen. He arrives in 9 days. The doctor finished his report and signed it with a flourish. I'll testify. And I'll make damn sure any judge knows that moving these babies from a stable, loving environment to an uncertain situation back east would be medical malpractice. He stood, gathering his bag. You're a good woman, Mara Bennett. Your husband would be proud of what you're doing. After he left, Mara stood at the window holding the doctor's report, her throat tight. Daniel would have loved Grace and Hope instantly, would have thrown himself into this fight without hesitation. She wished desperately that he was here, that she didn't have to face Edmund Carson alone. But she wasn't alone. That was the thing she kept forgetting and kept being reminded of. She had Rose and Miguel and Caleb, had neighbors willing to vouch for her, had a community that might be small but was fiercely loyal. Caleb had made the most progress in his research. He'd found mentions of the Carson family in old newspapers, their departure from Pennsylvania, their intention to claim land in Montana, their optimism about starting fresh in the territories. But there was no mention of Edmund Carson, no indication that he'd been part of their plans or even aware of the details of their journey. He wasn't involved in their lives, Caleb said, spreading out the newspaper clippings on the kitchen table. At least not in any way that made it into public record. And look at this. He pointed to an article about a business transaction in Philadelphia. Edmund Carson, merchant, completed sale of textile business to Henderson and Sons. That was 2 months before his brother headed west. So he was staying behind settling his affairs, Mara observed. Nothing wrong with that. No, Caleb agreed, but it shows his priorities. His brother was starting a dangerous journey with a young family, and Edmund was focused on business dealings. He looked up at her. I'm not saying he's a bad man, but I am saying there's no evidence he was particularly close to his brother or invested in his niece's lives. Mara studied the clippings, her mind working. Can we use this? Show a pattern of distance, of non-involvement? Maybe. If we can establish that he's motivated by obligation or inheritance rather than genuine care for the babies. Caleb's expression was thoughtful. The question is whether a judge will see it that way or just see a respectable businessman doing his familial duty. The days blurred together in a haze of preparation and anxiety. Mara cleaned the house until it gleamed, repaired the fence line that had been sagging for months, organized her financial records into neat stacks that told the story of a ranch running lean but stable. Rose sewed new dresses for Grace and Hope from fabric she'd been saving for herself. Tiny gowns with careful stitching that spoke of love in every seam. And through it all, Mara documented everything. She kept a journal of the twins' daily routines, their small milestones, the moments when Grace smiled at a funny face or Hope tracked Rose's movements across a room with alert curiosity. She wrote down feeding times and sleep patterns, noted which songs soothed them and which positions they preferred to be held in. She created a record of care so detailed that no one could question whether these babies were known, truly known, by the woman raising them. Caleb healed enough to start helping with ranch work, though Mara could see him favoring his injured shoulder and noticed the way he'd pause sometimes, hand pressed to his ribs where the infected wound was still tender. But his presence made a difference, not just in the work that got done, but in the solidarity it represented. He'd brought these babies here. He wasn't going to abandon them to an uncertain fate. One evening, 8 days before Edmund Carson's arrival, Mara found Caleb in the barn checking on the horses. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of amber and rose, and there was a quietness to the moment that made confession easier. I'm scared, she said without preamble. Caleb looked up from the horse he'd been brushing, his dark eyes steady. I know. What if everything we're doing isn't enough? What if he arrives with lawyers and legal precedents and just takes them? Her voice cracked. I don't think I can survive watching someone carry them away. Caleb set down the brush and crossed to where she stood in the barn doorway. Then we won't let it happen. We might not have a choice. There's always a choice. His voice was firm. Even if the law says he has the right, we can appeal. We can fight. We can make it so difficult and so public that he has to prove he actually wants those babies, not just the legal right to them. That could take months, years even. Then it takes years. Caleb's hand came to rest on her shoulder, the touch grounding. Mara, you saved my life. Let me help you save theirs. She looked up at him, at this man who'd ridden through hell for 2 babies he didn't know, and felt something shift in her chest. Caleb wasn't just an ally in this fight. He was someone who understood what it meant to choose family over blood, to decide that love was worth more than law. Why did you really bring them here? She asked quietly. The truth. Not because I'm capable or fair, but the real reason. Caleb was quiet for a moment, his hand still on her shoulder. Because you were alone in a house too big for one person, and I thought maybe you needed them as much as they needed you. His eyes met hers. Because I saw the way you looked when your husband's name came up in conversation, like something vital had been torn away. And I thought maybe 2 babies who'd lost everything could help heal someone else who'd lost everything. Mara's breath caught. That's presumptuous. I know. A faint smile touched his mouth. But I was half dead and desperate. Seemed like the time for presumption. Despite everything, Mara found herself almost laughing. You're insufferable. Frequently, his expression sobered. But I wasn't wrong, was I? About you and them needing each other? No, he hadn't been wrong. These babies had brought life back into a house that had felt like a mausoleum. They'd given her purpose beyond simple survival, had reminded her that the future wasn't just about enduring, but about building something worth having. No, she admitted. You weren't wrong. They stood there in the fading light, the barn settling into evening quiet around them, and Mara felt the weight of shared purpose binding them together. Whatever happened when Edmund Carson arrived, they would face it as a united front. The night before Carson's expected arrival, Mara couldn't sleep. She sat in the rocking chair beside the twins' cradle, watching them sleep in the moonlight that streamed through the window. They'd grown in the 2 weeks since Caleb had brought them here, filled out, became more responsive, developed the kind of trust that came from consistent care and genuine love. Grace slept with one tiny fist curled near her face, fierce even in sleep. Hope's expression was peaceful, serene, the quiet strength that defined her evident even in unconsciousness. I won't let him take you, Mara whispered into the darkness. I don't care what the law says. I don't care about blood relations or legal precedent. You're mine now, and I protect what's mine. It was a promise she had no idea how to keep, a vow that might prove impossible to fulfill. But she made it anyway, speaking it into existence like words alone could make it true. Morning came too quickly. Mara dressed carefully in her best dress, pinned her hair with extra care, tried to look like a woman capable of raising 2 children rather than someone barely holding herself together through sheer stubborn will. Rose had Grace and Hope dressed in their new gowns, both babies clean and content and heartbreakingly beautiful. Miguel had the wagon ready for the trip to town, the ranch looking as prosperous as 3 people working around the clock could make it appear. And Caleb stood on the porch in clothes he'd borrowed from Miguel, his injured shoulder bound tight beneath his shirt, his expression set in determined lines. You don't have to come, Mara said as she prepared to leave. This isn't your fight. Like hell it isn't. Caleb's voice was flat. I brought them here. I'm seeing this through. There was no point arguing. Mara nodded and climbed into the wagon, cradling Grace while Rose held Hope. Miguel took the reins and Caleb settled beside them, and together they headed toward town and whatever waited there. The journey felt both too long and too short. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs, her mind running through arguments and appeals and desperate scenarios. Beside her, Caleb sat quiet and solid, his presence a reminder that she wasn't facing this alone. Blackwater looked the same as always, dusty Main Street, handful of buildings, people going about their ordinary business, unaware that Mara's entire world hung in the balance. Marshal Brennan was waiting outside his office, and beside him stood a man Mara had never seen before. Edmund Carson was tall and lean, dressed in an expensive suit that spoke of Eastern money and Eastern values. His face was angular, intelligent, with the kind of careful control that came from a life spent in business negotiations. He looked nothing like the brother who'd headed west seeking adventure and new beginnings. He looked like a man who calculated risks and minimized losses. Mara's stomach dropped, but she kept her face composed as Miguel stopped the wagon and she climbed down, Grace secure in her arms. Carson's eyes went immediately to the baby, then to Hope, in Rose's arms. Something flickered across his expression, surprise perhaps, or recognition of family resemblance. Then it was gone, replaced by careful neutrality. "Mrs. Bennett," Marshal Brennan said, his voice carrying the weight of formality. "This is Edmund Carson, Mr. Carson, Mara Bennett, the woman who's been caring for your nieces." "Mr. Carson?" Mara kept her voice steady. "Thank you for coming all this way." Carson inclined his head slightly. "I confess I'm still somewhat in shock. When I received the marshal's telegram, I could hardly believe—" He paused, his eyes going again to the twins. "May I see them?" It wasn't really a question, but Mara appreciated that he'd phrased it as one. She stepped closer, angling Grace so Carson could see her face clearly. "This is Grace," she said. "Grace Carson Bennett. And that's Hope Carson Bennett, her sister." "You've named them." Carson's tone was unreadable. "They needed names, real names, chosen with care." Mara met his eyes steadily. They deserved that much. For a long moment, Carson studied Grace's small face. The baby gazed back at him with her usual alert curiosity, showing no fear of this stranger. Then Carson looked at Hope, his expression still carefully controlled. "They look healthy," he said finally. "They are healthy. Dr. Hayward examined them 3 days ago. I have his full report, along with documentation of their care, character references, and financial records." Mara's voice was calm despite the fear churning in her gut. "They've been well cared for, Mr. Carson. Loved. That's what matters." "What matters," Carson said quietly, "is determining their future, their long-term welfare." "Which is exactly what I want to discuss." Mara gestured toward the marshal's office. "Shall we?" Inside, the office felt too small for the weight of what was about to happen. Mara settled into a chair with Grace while Rose sat beside her holding Hope. Caleb stood behind them, silent but solid. Miguel waited outside with the wagon, ready for whatever came next. Marshal Brennan took his seat behind the desk, looking uncomfortable with his role as mediator. Edmund Carson remained standing, his posture perfect, his expression giving nothing away. "Mr. Carson," Mara began, deciding that offensive was better than defensive. "Before we discuss legalities, I want to know something. Did you know your brother was planning to head west? Were you aware he and his wife were traveling with infant daughters?" Carson's eyes narrowed slightly. "We had corresponded. I was aware of his plans, yes." "Did you support those plans?" "I advised against them, if you must know. The journey seemed unnecessarily risky, particularly with young children." His voice was measured. "Clearly, my concerns were warranted." "And yet, when they left, you didn't go with them. Didn't offer to help settle them in their new home." "I had business obligations. A life established here." Carson's tone sharpened slightly. "I fail to see how my choices regarding my brother's decisions are relevant to this situation." "They're relevant because they speak to your involvement in these babies' lives." Mara leaned forward slightly, Grace secure in her arms. "You've never met them, never sent gifts or letters inquiring about their welfare. You knew they existed but made no effort to be part of their lives while their parents were alive. Why should that change now that their parents are dead?" Carson's jaw tightened. "Because they're family, because the law gives me the right and the responsibility to determine their care." "The law gives you the legal standing," Caleb interjected, his voice calm but firm. "It doesn't give you the moral right to upend their lives when they're already settled and thriving." Carson turned to look at Caleb, seeing him properly for the first time. "And you are?" "Caleb Rowe. The man who found your nieces hidden under a burning wagon after your brother and sister-in-law were murdered. The man who rode 40 miles with a bullet in his shoulder to get them to safety." Caleb's eyes were hard. "So yes, I have standing in this conversation. I'm the reason they're alive." Something shifted in Carson's expression. Recognition of debt, perhaps, or acknowledgement of moral complexity. "I'm grateful for what you did, Mr. Rowe, truly. But gratitude doesn't change the reality of the situation." "What is the reality, Mr. Carson?" Mara asked. "Tell me honestly, what do you intend to do with these babies?" Carson was quiet for a moment, his eyes moving between grace and hope. When he spoke, his voice was careful. I intend to ensure they're raised properly, with education, opportunities, stability. Where? How? Mara pressed. Do you plan to raise them yourself? Hire a nurse? Send them to an institution? I haven't decided yet. Then let me help you decide. Mara stood, still holding Grace. These babies have already lost everything. Their parents, their home, their entire world. They were hidden and traumatized and saved by a stranger's stubborn refusal to leave them behind. And for the past 2 weeks, they've been here. Safe, loved, learning to trust again. She moved closer to Carson, close enough that he had to really look at Grace, had to see her as a person rather than an abstract responsibility. Grace wakes up crying sometimes at 3 in the morning, Mara said softly. She needs to be held close, to hear a heartbeat before she'll settle. Hope watches everything, processes the world around her with this serious expression that breaks your heart. They're starting to smile now, to respond to voices they recognize. They're learning that the world can be safe, that people can be trusted. Mara's voice strengthened. You want to take them to Philadelphia? To a strange city, a strange house, strange people? You want to undo all that trust they're building, make them start over with an uncle who's never held them, never fed them, never walked the floor at midnight while they cried. I can provide financial stability. They don't need financial stability, Mara interrupted. They need love, consistency. Someone who sees them as grace and hope, not as obligations or legal complications. Carson's composure cracked slightly. You think I don't want what's best for them? I think you want to do your duty, Mara said. And I respect that. But duty isn't love, Mr. Carson. Duty doesn't get up at 3 in the morning. Duty doesn't learn which songs soothe which baby. Duty doesn't fight tooth and nail to keep 2 children who aren't yours by blood, but are absolutely yours by choice. The office fell silent except for the small sounds Grace made, her tiny hand curling around Mara's finger with instinctive trust. Carson looked at that small hand, at his niece's peaceful face, and something in his carefully controlled expression finally showed emotion, grief, perhaps, or the weight of impossible choices. I failed my brother, he said quietly. I advised against the journey, but I didn't stop him. Didn't go with him to provide protection. When the telegram came saying everyone was dead, I thought, his voice caught. I thought at least it was over. At least there was nothing more I could fail at. And then you learned they survived, Caleb said, his tone gentler now. And then I learned they survived, and suddenly I had another chance, another way to fail or to finally do right by my brother's memory. Carson rubbed his face tiredly. I don't know how to raise children, Mrs. Bennett. I'm a businessman, a bachelor with no experience in domestic matters. But their family. Doesn't that count for something? It counts, Mara said softly, but it's not everything. Family is also the people who show up when you need them, the people who choose to stay when it's hard. She moved to sit back down, shifting Grace to her shoulder. I'm not trying to erase your connection to them, Mr. Carson. They should know who their parents were, should know they had an uncle who cared enough to travel all this way. But I'm asking you to consider what's truly best for them, not what the law says you're entitled to. Marshal Brennan cleared his throat. Perhaps we should take a recess. Give everyone time to consider their positions before making any decisions. Carson nodded slowly. That seems wise. I'll be staying at the hotel. Perhaps, he looked at Mara. Perhaps I could visit tomorrow, see them in their home environment, observe how they're cared for. It was more than Mara had hoped for. Of course. Come to the ranch tomorrow afternoon. See everything. Ask anything. We have nothing to hide. As they filed out of the marshal's office, Mara felt exhaustion and fragile hope warring in her chest. Carson hadn't demanded immediate custody, hadn't pulled legal rank or insisted on his rights. He'd agreed to see more before deciding. It wasn't victory, but it wasn't defeat either. Outside, Caleb touched her elbow lightly. You were magnificent in there. I was desperate, Mara corrected. Magnificent and desperate aren't mutually exclusive. His voice was warm. You gave him something to think about. That's all we can do. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, everyone lost in their own thoughts. Grace and Hope slept, blissfully unaware that their futures had just been debated like business transactions. Rose held Hope close, her young face troubled. Miguel drove with steady competence, giving them all space for their worries. And Mara stared at the horizon, at the endless prairie that had witnessed so much loss and survival, and wondered if love would actually be enough when law and blood stood against it. Tomorrow, Edmund Carson would see their home, would see the life they'd built in 2 short weeks, the routines and rhythms that had transformed chaos into family. Tomorrow, they would find out if choosing to fight had been courage or foolishness. Tonight, Mara held Grace close and whispered promises she still didn't know how to keep, hoping that hope itself might be enough to carry them through. The morning of Edmund Carson's visit arrived with deceptive calm. Mara woke before dawn, her body tense with anticipation despite barely having slept. She'd spent most of the night running through scenarios, imagining conversations, preparing for arguments that might never come. Now, in the gray pre-dawn light, she moved through the house with quiet purpose, checking details that had already been checked a dozen times. The kitchen was spotless. The twins' room was perfectly arranged. The financial records were organized on the dining table alongside Dr. Hayward's medical report and the character references. Everything spoke to capability, stability, love. Everything except the hollowness in Mara's chest that whispered it might not be enough. Rose appeared in the kitchen as coffee finished brewing, her hair already pinned and her dress crisp despite the early hour. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, pouring herself a cup. "Not really." Mara stood at the window, watching the sky lighten. What if he sees all this and still decides they'd be better off in Philadelphia? What if duty weighs more than love in his calculations? "Then we fight harder." Rose's voice carried the fierce certainty of youth. "We make him understand what he'd be taking from them." Mara wished she had that confidence, but she'd lived long enough to know that righteous certainty didn't always overcome legal reality. Sometimes love lost. Sometimes the people who deserved to win walked away empty-handed, while others claimed prizes they'd never earned. Upstairs, one of the twins began crying, Grace, based on the demanding tone. Mara headed up automatically, grateful for the distraction of immediate need. She found Grace red-faced and furious, her small fists waving in indignation at the injustice of waking hungry. Hope was stirring too, making the small sounds that meant she'd be fully awake soon. Mara lifted Grace, settling her against her shoulder with practiced ease. "Shh, little one. I know. The world's terribly unfair when you're hungry." She swayed gently, the motion as natural now as breathing. "But we'll fix that. We always fix it." As she changed Grace's diaper and prepared to feed her, Mara found herself memorizing details, the weight of Grace's small body, the fierce grip of her tiny fingers, the way her eyes locked onto Mara's face with absolute trust. If this was one of the last mornings she'd have with them, she wanted to remember everything. The thought made her throat tight. She pushed it away forcefully and focused on the practical work of caring for 2 babies who needed her, whether the law agreed or not. By the time Edmund Carson was due to arrive, the ranch looked as good as it ever had. Miguel had repaired the sagging fence post that had bothered Mara for months. Caleb had organized the barn with military precision. The house gleamed, the twins were fed and content, and Mara had changed her dress 3 times before settling on the simple green cotton that Daniel had always said made her eyes look brighter. She hated that she cared what Carson thought of her appearance, hated that she was performing capability instead of simply being herself, but too much hung in the balance for pride. Carson arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, driving a rented buggy and wearing another impeccable suit that looked absurdly formal against the prairie landscape. He climbed down carefully, his city shoes already dusty from the short drive from town, and paused to look at the ranch spread before him. Mara watched from the porch, Grace in her arms and Hope with Rose beside her. She tried to see her home through his eyes, the modest house that needed paint, the barn that leaned slightly to one side, the endless grass stretching to a horizon that must seem impossibly distant to a man accustomed to city streets and building walls. It wasn't much, but it was hers, built with Daniel's hands and maintained by her stubborn refusal to let it fall. And it was enough to raise 2 babies who needed space to grow and air to breathe and love that didn't come with conditions. "Mr. Carson," she called out. "Welcome." He approached the porch, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes taking in everything: the clean swept boards, the rocking chair where Mara spent evening hours with the twins, the small details that spoke to a home rather than just a house. "Mrs. Bennet," he nodded politely, "thank you for allowing me to visit." "This is your niece's home," Mara said simply. "You have every right to see it." She led him inside, through rooms she'd scrubbed until her hands were raw, past furniture that was simple but solid. Rose followed with Hope, while Caleb appeared from the direction of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag but staying back, giving Carson space but making his presence known. In the parlor, Mara had arranged chairs to create an intimate setting without feeling confrontational. She gestured for Carson to sit, then settled herself with Grace while Rose positioned herself nearby with Hope. Carson sat stiffly, his posture perfect, his hands folded in his lap. For a long moment, he simply looked at his nieces, his expression unreadable. "They've grown," he said finally. Mara blinked. "You've never seen them before." "No, but—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "I saw a photograph once. My brother sent it when the twins were first born. They were so small then, barely visible in their mother's arms." His voice caught slightly. "They look like her. My sister-in-law. Same eyes." It was the most personal thing Carson had revealed, and it shifted something in the room. This wasn't just a businessman calculating obligations. This was a man confronting the physical evidence of family he'd lost. "Tell me about them," Carson said quietly. "Your documentation shows schedules and medical facts, but tell me who they are." Mara looked down at Grace, at this fierce, small person who'd already taught her so much about strength. "Grace is the fighter," she said. "She knows what she wants and demands it without apology. When she's hungry, the whole county knows it. When she's content, she studies everything around her like she's memorizing it for later use." She smiled. "She's going to be formidable when she grows up. The kind of woman who changes things just by refusing to accept how they are." She glanced at Hope in Rose's arms. Hope is quieter, but no less strong. She watches, processes, understands things before she reacts. She's patient in a way that's almost eerie for a baby, but when she smiles, Mara's voice softened. When she smiles, it's like the sun coming out. Like she's decided you're worth trusting, and that trust is a gift. Carson listened with absolute attention, his eyes moving between the twins. "And they're healthy, truly thriving. See for yourself." Mara stood and crossed to him, holding Grace out slightly. "Would you like to hold her?" Uncertainty flickered across Carson's face. I'm not experienced with infants." "Neither was I 2 weeks ago," Mara admitted. "But they're remarkably resilient. Just support her head and hold her securely. She'll do the rest." Slowly, awkwardly, Carson reached out and accepted Grace into his arms. He held her with the careful stiffness of someone handling something both precious and terrifying. Grace looked up at him with her usual alert curiosity, studying this stranger's face with serious attention. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Grace made a small sound, not distressed, just observational, and her tiny hand reached up to grab at Carson's collar. Something in Carson's expression cracked. He looked down at the small person gripping his expensive suit with complete confidence, and Mara saw grief wash across his features, raw and unguarded. "She has my brother's chin," he whispered. "The same stubborn set to it. Thomas always looked like that when he was determined about something." His eyes were bright with unshed tears. She would have been his whole world, he and Mary both. They wanted children so desperately. "They saved them," Mara said softly. "In those last moments, they made sure Grace and Hope had a chance. That has to count for something." Carson nodded, not trusting his voice. He held Grace with increasing confidence, his businessman's control giving way to something more human, more broken. Rose moved closer with Hope. "Would you like to hold her too?" "I don't think I can manage both. I'll help." Rose settled Hope into Carson's other arm with gentle efficiency, and suddenly he was holding both nieces, both survivors, both pieces of a brother he'd never see again. Mara stepped back, giving him space for this moment. Beside her, Caleb had entered the room quietly, standing near the doorway like a sentinel. Carson looked between the twins. his carefully constructed composure completely shattered. When he spoke, his voice was thick. I should have gone with them. Should have insisted on accompanying them west, providing protection. If I had, maybe you'd be dead too, Caleb said bluntly but not unkindly. Or maybe the attackers would have been scared off by an extra man. Or maybe they would have just killed more people. You can't know, Mr. Carson. None of us can. But I could have tried. Instead, I stayed here, focused on business, told myself Thomas was making his own choices. Carson's arms tightened slightly around the twins. And now he's gone, and these babies are all that's left of him. They're not just remnants, Mara said firmly. They're not consolation prizes or replacements for what you lost. They're grace and hope, two complete people with their own futures ahead of them. The question isn't how to honor your brother's memory. It's what's actually best for them. Carson looked up at her, tears finally spilling over. And you think that's you? That keeping them here is what's best? I think, Mara said carefully, that they've already lost too much. That moving them across the country to live with an uncle they don't know, in a city that's nothing like the wide-open spaces they'll grow up loving, might be legal, but it isn't kind. I think stability matters. Familiarity matters. Love matters more than blood. I could love them, Carson said quietly. Given time, I could learn to be what they need. Could you? Mara moved closer, her voice gentle but relentless. Could you wake up with them at 3 a.m? Could you learn their different cries, their preferences, their fears? Could you put aside your business dealings to walk the floor with a fussy baby? Could you be patient through tantrums and illnesses and all the small daily challenges of raising children? She paused, letting the question settle. Or would you hire nurses to do it? Delegate their care to competent strangers while you continued your life largely unchanged? Because if that's the plan, Mr. Carson, then blood relation means nothing. They'd still be raised by people who aren't you, just in a different city with worse weather. Carson's jaw worked, the truth of her words clearly striking home. I don't know, he admitted. I honestly don't know if I'm capable of being what they need. Then let them stay with someone who is. Mara's voice was firm, but not unkind. You can be their uncle, visit them, write to them, be part of their lives, but let them grow up here, where they're known and loved and safe. The silence stretched out, heavy with the weight of a decision that would shape 3 lives irrevocably. Grace chose that moment to start fussing, her small face scrunching up in displeasure. Hope followed suit moments later, the twins' discomfort feeding off each other. Carson looked down at them helplessly, clearly having no idea what to do. Rose moved forward smoothly, taking Hope while Mara reclaimed Grace, both women settling the babies with practiced ease. You see? Mara said as she swayed with Grace. This is what they need. Not money or social standing or the right last name. They need someone who knows that Grace settles faster with movement and Hope prefers to be held still. They need someone who's learned these things through hours of trial and error, through nights of walking and days of patient attention. Carson stood slowly, looking at his empty arms like he wasn't sure what to do with them. May I see the rest of the house? Their room? Mara led him upstairs, pointing out the simple bathroom she and Daniel had added, the bedroom that had been meant for their own children someday, now transformed into a nursery. The cradle sat by the window, handmade and solid. Clean clothes were folded in a drawer, small gowns hung on hooks, waiting for the twins to grow into them. Carson moved to the window, looking out at the prairie. It's so empty out here, so isolated. It's peaceful, Mara corrected, and they'll never lack for space to run, to explore, to become whoever they're meant to be without city walls hemming them in. They'll lack for education, culture, opportunities. There's a school in Blackwater, a library, small but growing, and opportunities aren't just found in cities, Mr. Carson. Mara's voice strengthened. Out here, Grace and Hope can learn to ride, to understand the land, to be self-sufficient and strong. They can grow up knowing they're capable of anything because they've seen their mother. She caught herself but pushed forward. Because they've seen me run a ranch alone, manage finances, make hard decisions. What better education could they have? Carson turned to face her. You called yourself their mother. Mara's cheeks flushed. I misspoke. No. Carson interrupted gently. You didn't. You spoke the truth. He moved away from the window, his expression thoughtful. Mrs. Bennet, may I be frank with you? Please. I came here expecting to find a well-meaning widow trying to fill a void in her life with someone else's children. I expected to find adequate care, perhaps even good care, but nothing that couldn't be replicated or improved upon in Philadelphia. He paused. That's not what I found. Mara held her breath. I found a home, Carson continued. A real home where those babies are genuinely loved, truly known. I saw the way they relaxed when you held them, the way your helper girl anticipated their needs without being asked. I saw evidence of a community rallying around them, of people who've chosen to make them their concern. He rubbed his face tiredly, and I realized that taking them away from this would be cruel, even if it's legally my right. Hope surged in Mara's chest, but she tempered it carefully. What are you saying? I'm saying I need time to think, to decide what's actually right rather than what's simply legal. Carson met her eyes. Would you allow me to stay in the area for a few more days? To visit again, to see them in different contexts, to be certain of my decision? It wasn't the immediate victory Mara had hoped for, but it wasn't defeat either. Of course. Visit as often as you'd like. See everything. We have nothing to hide. They returned downstairs where Rose was feeding Hope, and Caleb had taken Grace, holding her with the comfortable ease of someone who'd done this before. Carson noticed the naturalness of it, the way Caleb supported her head without thinking, the way he murmured something soft to her that made her small face turn toward his voice. You've all become attached, Carson observed. We've all chosen to love them, Mara corrected. There's a difference. Attachment is passive. Love is a decision we make every day. Carson stayed for another hour, watching the routines of the household, asking questions about the twins' care. He was present when Mara changed Grace's diaper, when Rose sang softly to Hope, when Miguel came in from the barn and paused to stroke each baby's cheek with one weathered finger. And through it all, Mara could see him processing, calculating, measuring what he was seeing against whatever he'd imagined. She couldn't read his conclusions, couldn't tell if love was winning against law in his internal debate. When Carson finally left, promising to return the next day, Mara felt exhausted down to her bones. She sank into the rocking chair, Grace in her arms, and let her head fall back against the wood. That went well, Caleb offered, settling onto the floor beside the chair with Hope. He's genuinely conflicted. That's better than outright opposition. Conflicted means uncertain, Mara countered. Uncertain means he could go either way. Then we keep showing him what he'd be taking from them. Rose sat on the other side, her young face determined. We don't give him any reason to doubt that this is where they belong. The next 2 days followed a similar pattern. Carson arrived each afternoon, staying for hours, observing the twins in their routines. He was there when Grace had a fussy evening that required 2 hours of walking to soothe. He witnessed Hope's first genuine laugh, a sound so unexpected and joyful that everyone in the room froze in amazement. He saw Mara up to her elbows in laundry, Rose patiently mashing vegetables for the twins to try, Miguel carving a second rattle with patient precision. He saw the 1,000 small acts of love that built a family, the unglamorous reality of raising children. And gradually, Mara noticed a change in him. The stiff businessman's posture eased. The careful control gave way to something more genuine. He started asking questions that weren't about capability or resources, but about Grace's preferences and Hope's personality. He held them without prompting, his confidence growing with each visit. On the third evening, as the sun was setting and Carson was preparing to leave, he lingered on the porch where Mara stood watching the prairie turn gold. My brother loved sunsets, he said quietly. Used to say they were proof that endings could be beautiful too. Mara looked at him, seeing grief written in every line of his frame. I'm sorry you lost him. I'm sorry I wasn't the brother he deserved while he was alive. Carson's voice was raw. I was so focused on my own life, my own concerns. I told him heading west was foolish, that he was risking his family for a dream that would probably fail. Our last conversation was an argument. He knew you cared, Mara said gently. Brothers fight. It doesn't mean the love isn't real. How do you know? You didn't know us. Because he named his daughters Grace and Hope. Mara shifted the baby in her arms. Those are names that speak to faith in the future, to believing in possibilities. A man who named his children that way wasn't holding on to anger or bitterness. He was looking forward. Carson was quiet for a long moment. How did you lose your husband? The question caught Mara off guard. She'd become so focused on defending her capability that she'd forgotten grief could be a bridge rather than a weakness. Accident, she said softly. Horse threw him, head injury. He was gone before I could even get him to the doctor. She looked out at the prairie where Daniel had loved to ride. 3 years ago this October. Some days it feels like yesterday. Other days it feels like he's been gone my whole life. And the babies? They help? They give me a reason to look forward instead of back, Mara admitted. They need me to be strong, to be capable, to build a future. There's no room for wallowing in grief when you're responsible for 2 small lives that depend on you completely. Carson nodded slowly. I think... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I think Thomas would have wanted them here, with someone who chose to fight for them rather than someone claiming them out of obligation. He turned to face her fully. You love them. Really love them. I can see it in everything you do. I do, Mara said simply. More than I thought possible after such a short time. Then I have a proposal for you. Carson's voice was steady now, decision made. I won't fight you for custody. I'll acknowledge that this is their home, that you're their guardian in every way that matters. But I want to remain part of their lives. I want to visit, to write, to know them as they grow. I want them to know they had a family beyond what was lost, that their father had a brother who cared even if he failed to show it when it mattered most. Relief and gratitude crashed over Mara so powerfully she could barely speak. Yes, of course, always. I'll have my lawyer draw up papers, Carson continued. Legal guardianship transferred to you, with my blessing and full support. I'll provide financial assistance if you need it, not as charity, but as an uncle helping to raise his nieces. And I'll expect regular updates, photographs if possible, and the opportunity to visit at least twice a year. You'll always be welcome here, Mara managed, her voice thick with unshed tears. Grace and Hope will know their uncle, will grow up understanding they're loved by more people than just us. Carson looked down at Grace in Mara's arms, then back at the house where Rose was visible through the window holding Hope. I'm doing the right thing. I'm certain of that. But it doesn't mean it doesn't hurt, giving them up. You're not giving them up, Mara said firmly. You're choosing what's best for them over what's easiest for you. That's not loss, Mr. Carson. That's love. His eyes glistened in the fading light. Edmund, please, if we're to be family, call me Edmund. Edmund, Mara repeated, and it felt like a promise. Thank you for seeing them, for understanding what they need. He nodded once, then descended the porch steps and climbed into his buggy. But before he drove away, he turned back. Take care of them, Mara. Love them enough for all of us who couldn't be there. I will, she promised, every single day. She stood on that porch long after Edmund Carson disappeared into the gathering dusk, Grace warm and solid in her arms, and let herself finally believe that they were safe, that this fight was won, that these babies she'd come to love so fiercely would stay right where they belonged. Inside, Caleb appeared in the doorway, backlit by lamplight. Is it over? It's over, Mara confirmed, turning to face him. He's giving me guardianship. They're staying. The smile that broke across Caleb's face was like sunrise, fierce and bright and full of joy. Then we did it. We actually did it. We did it, Mara agreed and stepped into the house where Rose was crying happy tears over Hope, where Miguel was trying to hide his emotion behind gruff practicality, where her family, her chosen, cobbled together, impossible family, was celebrating a victory that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. Grace chose that moment to let out an imperious cry, reminding everyone that babies cared nothing for dramatic moments and everything for their immediate needs. The sound broke the tension, turned tears to laughter, and reminded them all that life continued in its messy, beautiful, demanding way. Mara fed Grace while Rose tended to Hope, while Caleb and Miguel prepared dinner, while the house filled with the sounds of ordinary life made extraordinary by shared purpose and genuine love. Later, after the babies were asleep and the others had retired to their rooms, Mara sat alone in the rocking chair and let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. She'd fought for these babies and won. She'd stood against law and blood and the reasonable arguments of a decent man, and she'd made him see that love mattered more than any of it. Daniel would have been proud. The thought came unbidden, but welcome. He'd always believed in fighting for what was right, in choosing courage over comfort. He would have loved Grace and Hope instantly, would have thrown himself into this battle without hesitation. But Daniel was gone, and Mara had learned to fight her own battles. Had learned that strength didn't mean never being afraid, but rather doing what needed doing despite the fear. She looked around her house, at the cradle by the window, at the small gowns hanging on hooks, at all the evidence of lives being built here, and felt something settle in her chest. This was her family now. Not the one she'd planned for, not the one she'd imagined on her wedding day, but the one life had given her through tragedy and choice and stubborn refusal to give up. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The legal papers arrived 3 weeks later, delivered by Marshal Brennan with a solemnity that suggested he understood the weight of what they represented. Mara sat at the kitchen table with Caleb beside her and read through the formal language that transformed hope into certainty. Edmund Carson had done exactly what he'd promised. Transferred full legal guardianship to Mara, established a modest trust fund for the twins' future education, and retained only the rights of a caring uncle who wished to remain connected to his nieces' lives. "It's really over," she said, her fingers tracing the signatures that made it official. "They're mine." "They were always yours," Caleb said quietly. "This just makes the world acknowledge what we already knew." Marshal Brennan cleared his throat. "There's one more thing, Mrs. Bennett. Carson left a letter for you, asked me to deliver it with the papers." Mara accepted the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, Edmund Carson's careful script covered 2 pages. The letter spoke of gratitude and grief in equal measure. Carson wrote about visiting his brother's grave before leaving Nebraska, about finally making peace with choices that couldn't be changed. He wrote about watching Mara with grace and hope and recognizing something he could never provide: the fierce, protective love of someone who'd chosen these children, not out of duty, but out of genuine connection. He wrote about his own inadequacies, his recognition that being a good uncle meant knowing when to step back and let others lead. But it was the final paragraph that made Mara's throat tighten. "You asked me once what my brother would have wanted," Carson had written. "I've thought about that question every day since. Thomas loved adventure, loved possibility, loved the idea of building something new in wild spaces. He would have wanted his daughters raised by someone who understood that same spirit, someone strong enough to thrive where others might merely survive. He would have wanted them to grow up free and fierce and unafraid of wide horizons. I believe he would have chosen you, Mara Bennett, and so I choose you in his stead, trusting that you'll give Grace and Hope the life their parents dreamed of but couldn't provide. Be their mother in every way that matters. Love them enough for all of us. And please, let them know their uncle thinks of them often and wishes them every happiness this world can offer." Mara read the letter aloud to Caleb and the marshal, her voice breaking only once. When she finished, silence filled the kitchen, the kind of quiet that held respect for difficult choices made with integrity. "He's a good man," Brennan said finally. "Doesn't make it right or wrong what happened, but he's good. That counts for something." "It counts for everything," Mara agreed, carefully folding the letter. "Grace and Hope will know they had an uncle who loved them enough to let them go. That's a gift." After Brennan left, Mara sat with the papers spread before her and felt the full weight of what she'd taken on. These babies were her responsibility now, legally and permanently. Their futures rested in her hands, their education, their health, their happiness, all of it hers to shape and guide and nurture. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "You're spiraling," Caleb observed, watching her face. "I can see it happening." "I'm just thinking about everything that could go wrong. What if I make mistakes? What if I'm not enough?" Mara looked up at him. "What if they grow up and resent that I kept them here, instead of letting them have the advantages Edmund could have provided?" Caleb reached across the table and took her hand, his grip firm and grounding. "Then you'll handle it, the same way you've handled everything else, with strength and stubbornness and more love than any 2 babies have a right to expect." His voice softened. Mara, you've already proven you're enough. Everything else is just details. She wanted to believe him, wanted to have his certainty that love and determination would be sufficient. But doubt was a persistent companion, whispering questions she couldn't fully silence. The sound of babies crying upstairs interrupted her spiral. Rose called down that both twins were awake and demanding attention, and Mara rose automatically, the immediate need overriding her anxious thoughts. This was the reality of motherhood, she was learning. Not grand gestures or perfect decisions, but the constant grinding work of showing up day after day, meeting needs, providing comfort, building trust through 1,000 small actions that accumulated into something larger than their parts. Summer deepened into the kind of heat that made the prairie shimmer. The twins grew stronger, more alert, more engaged with the world around them. Grace's personality became increasingly evident, demanding, curious, quick to anger, and quick to forgiveness. Hope remained the quieter observer, but her smiles when they came were radiant enough to stop Mara's heart. Caleb stayed on at the ranch, his presence becoming so natural that Mara sometimes forgot he hadn't always been there. His shoulder healed slowly, limiting what he could do, but he made himself useful in countless ways. Helping with the horses, repairing things around the house, spelling Rose when she needed rest, sitting with the twins while Mara handled ranch business. One evening in late July, Mara found him on the porch at sunset, Hope asleep against his shoulder while he watched the sky turn colors that defied description. "You don't have to stay, you know," she said, settling into the other rocking chair with grace. "You've more than fulfilled any obligation you might have felt." Caleb looked at her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Is that what you think? That I'm here out of obligation?" "I don't know why you're here," Mara admitted. "You're a drifter, Caleb. You've worked a dozen ranches in the past year, never staying anywhere long. But you've been here almost 2 months now, working for room and board when you could be earning real wages somewhere else. Maybe I like it here. Or maybe you feel responsible for what happens to these babies because you're the one who brought them." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his hand gentle on Hope's small back. "You want the truth?" "Always. I stayed at first because I needed to see them safe. Needed to know that bringing them here wasn't a mistake born of desperation and blood loss." He paused, choosing words carefully. "But I kept staying because somewhere along the way, this stopped feeling like a job or an obligation and started feeling like home." Mara's breath caught. "Caleb, I'm not asking for anything," he interrupted gently. "I know you're still grieving your husband. I know this family you're building doesn't necessarily have room for me beyond what I already am. But you asked why I stay, and that's the truth. I stay because leaving would mean walking away from the only place I've belonged in longer than I can remember." The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable in a way that made Mara's chest ache. She looked at this man who'd ridden through hell to save 2 babies, who'd fought beside her to keep them, who'd seamlessly woven himself into the fabric of their daily lives. What if there was room? She heard herself ask. What if this family could expand to include someone who chose us as deliberately as we chose these babies? Caleb's eyes met hers, hope and caution warring in their depths. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" "I don't know," Mara said honestly. "I'm not ready for—" She gestured vaguely, unable to articulate the complexity of grief and new feelings and practical considerations. "But I know I don't want you to leave. I know that when I think about the future, about raising Grace and Hope, I see you in it, not as hired help or even as a friend, but as—" She paused, searching for the right word. "As family, as someone who belongs here permanently." "I'm not Daniel," Caleb said quietly. "I can't replace what you lost." "I'm not asking you to." Mara shifted Grace to her other arm, the baby's warm weight grounding her. "Daniel was my first love, and I'll always carry that. But maybe there's room for something different. Something built not on who we were, but on who we're becoming." Caleb stood slowly, careful not to wake Hope, and moved to lean against the porch railing, facing Mara. "I came to Nebraska with nothing. No family, no prospects, just a horse and a willingness to work. I never expected to find a reason to stop moving." His voice was rough with emotion. "But then I found 2 babies who needed saving and a woman strong enough to save them, and somehow that became everything I didn't know I was looking for. So stay, Mara said simply. Not as a hand, but as a partner. Help me raise these babies. Help me run this ranch. Help me build something worth having. Are you proposing to me, Mara Bennett? The question caught her off guard, and she laughed despite the seriousness of the moment. God, no, not yet. Maybe not ever in the traditional sense. She met his eyes steadily. But I'm asking you to commit to this life we're building, to be present and permanent, to be someone Grace and Hope can count on, the way they count on me. And you? Caleb asked. Can you count on me? Mara thought about the past 2 months, about watching Caleb with the twins, seeing his patience and gentleness and fierce protectiveness. She thought about the way he'd fought beside her against Edmund Carson, the way he anticipated needs before she voiced them, the way he'd made himself indispensable without demanding anything in return. Yes, she said. I already do. Relief and joy transformed Caleb's face. He looked down at Hope sleeping against his shoulder, then back at Mara. Then I'm staying, for as long as you'll have me, as whatever you'll have me. They sat together on that porch as stars emerged and the prairie settled into night quiet, two people who'd been broken in different ways finding unexpected wholeness in shared purpose. It wasn't the romance of storybooks or the passion of youth. It was something steadier, built on respect and partnership, and the recognition that family was what you chose to build, not what you were given. The months that followed brought their own challenges and triumphs. The twins learned to hold their heads up, to roll over, to make sounds that weren't quite words but suggested language was coming. Grace remained the demanding one, crying until her needs were met with the precision she required. Hope stayed quieter but revealed a stubborn streak of her own when pushed, a determination that manifested in patient persistence rather than vocal demands. Caleb proved himself invaluable in ways Mara hadn't anticipated. He had a gift with horses that expanded the ranch's reputation, and soon they were fielding requests from neighboring spreads to train difficult animals. The additional income eased financial pressures Mara had carried for years, allowed for repairs and improvements that made the ranch more sustainable. But more than his practical contributions, Caleb brought balance to a household that had been running on Mara's sheer will alone. He spelled her when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, took night shifts with fussy babies, handled the 1,000 small crises that arose when raising twins while managing a working ranch. And slowly, carefully, something deeper grew between them. Not to replace what Mara had lost, but to build something new alongside it. They learned each other's rhythms, their communication becoming economical, a look, a gesture, a half-finished sentence that the other completed without thought. Rose noticed first, her young eyes sharp for the small intimacies that marked changing relationships. She said nothing directly, but Mara caught her smiling when Caleb's hand lingered on Mara's shoulder, or when they stood close while discussing ranch business, or when Caleb said something that made Mara laugh in a way she hadn't in years. Miguel was more direct. "You going to marry that boy?" he asked one afternoon while they were mending fence together. Mara nearly dropped her hammer. "What? Don't play stupid with me. I've known you too long." Miguel's weathered face creased with amusement. "He's a good man, better than most, and he looks at you like you hung the moon, and at those babies like they're his own blood." "It's complicated," Mara hedged. "Love always is. Doesn't make it less worth pursuing." Miguel drove a fence post with precise strikes. "Your husband was a good man, too. Best I ever worked for. But he's gone, Mara, and you're still here, still living. And if that man in your barn makes living easier, makes it better, then seems to me you'd be a fool not to claim that happiness." The words stayed with Mara, circling in her mind as autumn painted the prairie in golds and reds. She thought about Daniel, about the love they'd shared and the future they'd planned. She thought about Caleb, about the partnership they'd built, and the feelings that had grown quietly between them. And she thought about Grace and Hope, about giving them a family that was whole and stable, with two parents who chose each other and chose them. The decision, when she made it, felt less like a leap and more like acknowledging what had already become true. She found Caleb in the barn one October evening, working with a young horse that had been skittish since arrival. He moved with patient confidence, his voice low and soothing, his hands gentle but firm. Watching him, Mara saw not just a good man, but the right man. Someone whose values aligned with hers, whose strength complemented rather than competed with her own. "Caleb," she said from the doorway. He looked up, saw something in her expression, and immediately gave the horse to Miguel's care. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." Mara stepped into the barn, dust motes dancing in the late afternoon light. "I've been thinking about what you said, about staying, about family, about building something permanent. And," his voice was carefully neutral, but she could see hope in his eyes. "And I think we should make it official, not just in practice, but in law." She took a breath. "I'm asking you to marry me, Caleb Rowe, to be my husband and a father to Grace and Hope. To build this life we've already started building, but to do it with the kind of commitment that can't be walked away from." Caleb crossed to her in 3 long strides, his hands coming up to frame her face. "You're sure? This is what you want?" "I'm sure," Mara said, and meant it completely. "I love Daniel, and I always will, but he's gone, and you're here. And I've learned that love isn't a finite resource. There's room in my heart for what was and what is, for honoring the past while building the future." "Then yes," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes to all of it. To marriage, to family, to every day of whatever comes next." He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, and Mara felt something in her chest unlock, the last piece of grief that had been holding her back from fully embracing what stood before her. They married in November, a simple ceremony in Mara's parlor with Marshall Brennan officiating and Rose standing witness while Miguel held both twins. Grace fussed through the vows, her imperious cries punctuating the solemn words. Hope watched with her usual serious attention, as if understanding that something important was happening. Edmund Carson sent a telegram of congratulations along with an extravagant gift, a silver rattle for each twin, engraved with their full names, Grace Carson Bennett Rowe and Hope Carson Bennett Rowe. The gesture touched Mara deeply, this evidence that Carson had accepted not just her guardianship but the family she was building around his nieces. Winter came gently that year, with snow that transformed the prairie into something magical and pristine. Mara and Caleb settled into married life with the easy partnership they'd already established, the wedding rings on their fingers more confirmation than transformation. The twins celebrated their first birthday in March with a small party that felt enormous in its joy. Grace demanded to be the center of attention, charming everyone with her fierce personality and infectious laughter. Hope was content to observe from Caleb's arms, but when she finally smiled, that radiant, transformative smile, the entire room seemed to light up. Watching her daughters, her husband, her found family gathered in celebration, Mara felt a fullness that had nothing to do with what she'd lost, and everything to do with what she'd gained. This wasn't the life she'd planned. Daniel's absence still ached on quiet days, still caught her by surprise in unguarded moments. But it was a good life, a full life. A life built not on avoiding pain, but on choosing joy despite it. That night, after the guests had left and the twins were asleep, Mara stood on her porch watching the stars emerge. Caleb joined her, slipping an arm around her waist with the casual intimacy of partnership. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Mara leaned into him, solid and warm and permanent. "I'm thinking about that day you rode up to my fence line, barely alive, with 2 babies in your arms. How impossible everything seemed. How much I wanted to send you away because I was afraid of feeling anything again." "But you didn't send us away." "No," she agreed. "I chose to fight instead. For them, for you, for this family we've built." She turned to face him fully. "That was the best decision I ever made." Caleb's arms tightened around her. "We made it together. Every choice after that first one, we made together." He was right. The fight for guardianship, the decision to marry, the daily work of raising 2 strong-willed girls, none of it had been solitary. They'd built this family through shared determination, through choosing each other repeatedly in small moments and large ones. "Do you think they'll remember?" Mara asked. "Grace and Hope, when they're older. Do you think they'll remember what it took to keep them here?" "I think they'll know they were loved enough that people fought for them," Caleb said. "That's what matters. Not the details of legal battles or difficult choices, but knowing they were worth fighting for." Mara thought about Edmund Carson's letter. about the way he'd chosen the twins' well-being over his own rights. She thought about Caleb's 40-mile ride, about her own stubborn refusal to give up. She thought about Rose and Miguel and everyone who'd rallied around two orphaned babies. They were worth it, she said softly. Every moment of fear, every sleepless night, every battle, they were worth all of it. Inside, one of the twins began crying, Grace based on the imperious tone. Mara smiled and started toward the door, but Caleb caught her hand. "I'll get her," he said. "You rest." She watched him disappear into the house. This man who'd saved her daughters and somehow saved her too, and felt gratitude so profound it bordered on prayer. The years that followed brought the expected challenges. Teething and illness, first words and first steps, the terrible twos multiplied by having twins with very different personalities. Grace grew into a force of nature, demanding and fierce and utterly fearless. Hope remained the quieter one, but her determination proved equally formidable when engaged. The ranch prospered under Caleb and Mara's joint management. They expanded the horse training operation, hired additional hands as the work grew, became known throughout the territory for quality stock and fair dealing. Miguel eventually retired but stayed on in a cabin Caleb built for him, unwilling to leave the family he'd helped raise. Rose married a neighboring rancher's son and started her own family, but remained close, bringing her children to play with Grace and Hope, the next generation of found family, learning the same values of loyalty and chosen connection. And through it all, Edmund Carson kept his promise. He visited twice a year, bringing gifts and stories of Philadelphia that seemed impossibly exotic to girls growing up on the prairie. Grace and Hope knew him as Uncle Edmund, the man who loved them enough to let them go, who chose their happiness over his own desires. On Hope's 10th birthday, Edmund arrived with something different, a leather-bound journal containing everything he'd learned about their parents, letters. Thomas and Mary had sent before their deaths, photographs Mara had never seen, stories about their lives and dreams and the love that had created these two remarkable girls. "I thought they should know where they came from," Edmund explained, handing the journal to Mara. "Not to replace what you've given them, but to complete the picture." That night, with both girls nestled between them in bed, Mara and Caleb read aloud from the journal. They learned about Thomas's sense of adventure, Mary's quiet strength, the hopes and dreams that had driven them west. And when they reached the final entry, a letter Mary had written to her daughters just weeks before the attack, Mara's voice broke. "My darling girls," Mary had written, "if you're reading this, it means something has gone wrong. But please know this. You were loved from your first breath. You were wanted, celebrated, adored. Your father and I would have done anything to protect you, to give you the best life possible. If we couldn't be there to raise you, I pray you find someone who will love you as fiercely as we do. Someone who will teach you to be strong and kind and unafraid of whatever challenges this world brings. Someone who will see you for the extraordinary souls you are and nurture that light until it shines bright enough to illuminate even the darkest places. Be brave, my loves. Be joyful. Be everything we dreamed you could become." Grace and Hope listened with rapt attention, tears streaming down their young faces as they learned about the parents they'd never known, but who'd loved them desperately. "Did they save us?" Hope asked quietly. "Our mama and papa?" "Yes," Mara said firmly. "They hid you when danger came, made sure you had a chance to survive even when they couldn't. And Uncle Edmund gave us to you," Grace added, her fierce mind already connecting the pieces, "because he knew you'd love us right." "Well, everyone who touched your lives made choices that kept you safe," Caleb said, his arm around both girls. "Your parents, your uncle, Mara, even me. We all chose you. That's what makes a family, not blood, but choices. People deciding you're worth fighting for." "Are we worth it?" Hope asked, her voice small. Mara gathered both girls close, these babies who'd grown into bright, determined children. "You're worth everything, every sacrifice, every fight, every moment of fear or doubt. You're worth it all, and more." The girls fell asleep between them that night, the journal carefully set aside to be explored more thoroughly in the days ahead. Mara looked across their sleeping daughters at Caleb and saw her own emotion reflected in his eyes. "We did good," he said quietly. "We did," Mara agreed. We gave them everything Mary asked for: a home, love, the strength to be extraordinary. 20 years after that impossible ride that had changed everything, Mara stood on her porch watching the horizon. She was older now, her hands weathered from decades of ranch work, her hair shot through with silver. Beside her, Caleb had aged into distinguished strength, the scars from that long-ago injury barely visible now. The ranch had grown substantially. Grace and Hope, now young women of 22, managed much of the operation themselves. Grace handled the business side with fierce competence, negotiating deals and expanding their reputation. Hope worked with the horses, her quiet patience producing remarkable results. Both had suitors. Both had dreams that extended beyond the ranch. But they'd grown up strong and confident, unafraid of wide horizons, exactly as their birth mother had hoped. Edmund Carson had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving his entire estate to his nieces, with a letter expressing his gratitude for the joy they'd brought to his life. The gesture had moved Grace and Hope deeply, this final evidence of how much their uncle had loved them. "Do you ever regret it?" Caleb asked, coming to stand beside Mara. "The path we took, the life we built?" Mara thought about everything that had led to this moment. The grief of losing Daniel, the terror of fighting for guardianship, the slow building of partnership with Caleb, the 1,000 daily choices that had accumulated into a lifetime. "Not for a second," she said. "This life, this family, it wasn't what I planned, but it's everything I needed." She looked out at the prairie that had witnessed so much transformation. Somewhere out there on this same endless grass, Caleb had ridden through hell to save 2 babies. Edmund Carson had chosen love over law. She herself had decided that strength meant fighting for what mattered rather than protecting herself from pain. And from all that choosing, all that fighting, all that stubborn refusal to accept that love had limits, from all of that had come this: a family forged not by blood but by decision, made permanent not by law but by loyalty, and built to last not because it was easy but because it was right. Grace emerged from the house, Hope right behind her, both young women beautiful and strong and utterly themselves. They joined their parents on the porch, a family complete and unbreakable. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked, leaning against the railing. "The ride that changed everything," Mara said, smiling at Caleb, "and how the hardest choices sometimes lead to the best destinations." "Tell us again," Hope requested, as she had 100 times before, "about how Papa saved us, and how you fought to keep us, and how Uncle Edmund chose love." So Mara told the story again, the way she always did, honestly, completely, holding nothing back. She told them about terror and determination, about legal battles and moral victories, about the way a family could be built from broken pieces if people were brave enough to choose love over fear. And when she finished, as the sun set over the prairie in colors that still defied description, Grace and Hope understood what they'd always known but needed to hear repeated. They were loved. Fiercely, completely, permanently. By parents who'd chosen them, an uncle who'd sacrificed for them, and a community that had rallied around them. That was the legacy Mara and Caleb had built. Not a perfect life, but a true one. Not a family defined by blood, but by something stronger. The daily choice to show up, to fight, to love, without reservation or retreat. On a wide Nebraska plain, in a house that had once felt too empty and now felt exactly full enough, a family forged in fire and choice and stubborn hope settled into evening. The twins who'd survived the impossible had grown into women ready to face whatever came next. The man who'd saved them had become the father they deserved. And the woman who'd fought for them had learned that the heart's capacity for love was limited only by courage. It was enough. It had always been enough. And it would continue to be enough for all the years ahead, because that's what family meant, choosing each other, day after day, in ways both grand and small, until choosing became breathing and love became life itself. The story that had begun with a desperate ride ended here, in peace and wholeness, and the quiet satisfaction of a battle won not through force, but through the stubborn insistence that love, in all its forms, mattered more than anything else the world could offer.